Before we continue on, we should probably take a look at the bump settings for our Modo's logo and the cherries. As you can see, the cherries aren't popping out as much. In fact, it looks like they're a bit depressed into the surface rather than protruding. And the Modo's logos themselves, while they're popping out at us, looks like it might be a little too much. Let's take a look at the cherry Modo's image here that we're using for the bump. And it looks like the opacity is down at 2%. And the reason is because we actually duplicated the specular layer, which has an opacity of 2%, which is perfect for opacity, but not necessarily for bumper displacement. Let's crank that all the way back up to 100%. You can see it's still depressed into the surface rather than protruding, but it's definitely standing out more than it was before. You might recall that since we're using a bump for this, Modo automatically converts the colors to a grayscale image. And in this case, it's being inverted, just like we wanted for the specularity, but we don't want that for the bump. And as soon as we turn off invert, it definitely pops out at you a lot more, and it looks a lot better. Now, one thing I noticed too is that the color here is kind of distracting me from the real issue. So let's go ahead and turn that to a different color. We'll go with just pure white. So we'll change this to 1. It's a little less distracting here. And we can also turn off the bursts. Let's also turn off the color and specular layers for all of these. And then for the bump, make sure they're turned on. And now we can get a much better idea of what's going on here. You can see the Modo's logo is really sticking out quite a lot. And what we need to do is hone in on what's going to equalize the bump between these two. And we can use the opacity or the high and low values to do so. In this case, it'd be better and easier to just tweak the opacity. So let's go down to 50%. That brings us much closer to what we want for the bump here. But now that they're so close, the bump itself needs to be tweaked. 2 centimeters is a little too high. Let's go down to 5 millimeters. And that's more or less where I want it. Somewhere between 2.5 and 6 millimeters should be ample bump for this. But one thing I'd like to check is actually using displacement. Let's set this to 5 millimeters as well. Select both of these layers that we have the bump on, right click, go down to surface shading and set it to displacement. And you can see that at the 5 millimeters, it's much too high. So let's go back to the material. We'll set this to 2.5 millimeters. And again, that's still a little too high. So let's go down to 1 millimeter. And 1 millimeter, if you plan on using displacement, is very close, but still probably a little too much. Let's go to 0.75 millimeters. And that's about where we want it. So let's go ahead and type in 0.075, which is 0.75 millimeters into the bump amplitude as well. And now let's change these back to bump. Now, the reason I just did that is so with displacement, it's visually more accurate to see, even though we're not rendering with a displacement map. You could if you wanted to, but I would say for this level of detail, it's really quite unnecessary. So we're really just using it as a tool to hone in on the value that we want. Now we can turn those other layers back on that we just turned off, including the bursts. Now we can focus our attention on the base color for the box. The way we're going to do this is we're going to add a gradient layer. So let's just go ahead in the shader tree, hit add layer, go to processing, gradient. And it's at the very top here, which we don't want. Let's put it inside of the box group. And you'll see that everything turns white. And the reason everything is turning white is because the color is pure white inside of the gradient. And you can see that over here on the right-hand properties panel. We add another keyframe, which you can do by middle clicking in this bar here. Select all the keys there, and let's make this a black. And now you can see that our gradient is being applied, but what it's doing here is that it's using the input parameter of incidence angle. And that's not what we want. Let's change this to locator distance. That's under sample parameters, distance to locator. And we're going to use the world space, not object space. Okay, so you can see now gradient is very white on the top and black on the bottom. That's because our locator is somewhere up above here. And the reason I know that is because the white is the center and the black is the outer area. So let's go find our locator. And there it is, floating out in the middle of nowhere. let's go ahead and activate the transform tool with the W key. Let's go to texture locator and right here under position XYZ, hit this icon here to make it all equal sign and then just hit 0. So now it's at world 0. And we want this to be right around the center of the box, just for now. Okay, so right about there. Maybe not quite dead center, but pretty close. And before we continue doing anything, the texture locator size is really killing me. Let's go ahead and change that. And we'll activate the scale tool and just scale this on down. Now, I don't want to make it too small because I want to be able to grab it and move it in the 3D viewport. So let's just have it so it's poking through the box on the front and back. And in fact, maybe the sides, just something like that. Now, you also notice that the box is entirely white again. And the reason for that is the gradient here, which you can't tell right off in this little preview, what the values are from this end to the other end. And if we open the gradient, right here with this arrow, open gradient, you can see that this second keyframe at black is all the way over at 60 centimeters. And if you recall during the modeling phase, that the width of this box is approximately 14 centimeters. So what we need to do is set this something close to 14 centimeters. Let's go down to about 10. And that's actually pretty close to what we want for the effect here. And what we want to do is set the black area to be a little more inward toward the center. And what I want is to tighten up the gradient and bring that black area to be closer toward the center. So we can just move this keyframe in a little bit more. Let's expand this view here. With the Alt right mouse button, we can zoom in. And so you can also select multiple keyframes and just hit Shift A, and that will frame all of the selected keyframes you have. Oh yeah, we'll put it right there. Now that's a little too much, so let's bring it on out. So we'll say right about there. Actually, right at about 10 centimeters. In fact, we'll just key that in at 10 centimeters. Now, of course, we don't want black and white, so let's change something that actually complements the rest of the colors of our box here. And we have some bright red and green, and the background color I would like to have emanating from the center a bright yellow color. And we'll have this edging more toward green rather than orange or red. So we'll say right about there. Yeah. Okay, let's grab that second keyframe. And this one is going to be green. And we also want this one to edge more toward yellow. Now, I like where the keyframe or edge of the green color is. That's perfectly fine. However, the yellow isn't large enough. It's not encompassing enough area. So what we can do is just grab that keyframe and drag it on over toward the green keyframe. All right. So I like that right there. We'll probably come back and do a little more tweaking, but I really like where that's at. We still can't see the rest of our textures over this gradient. So let's make that happen. Back in the shader tree, we need to move this gradient to be at the very bottom of the material groups list, but above the base material. So click and drag that on down. Now you can see that it's applied to everything. However, we do have one small issue. And that issue is the second material that we have that's controlling the bump of the logos on the top here. Now, we have a couple of ways we could deal with this. Let's go ahead and open our group here first. And here's the material. We have a couple of ways we could do this. We could duplicate these bump images here of both the icons and set them up as group masks and mask out the material itself so that way the background colors punch through. We could just delete this material and use one base material, but in my opinion, that's not really very reasonable because in a lot of cases, you're going to want to have multiple images on your meshes with different bump, displacement, or normal values outside of what you have from the base material or other materials. So the third way is actually quite simple, and all you need to do is change the blending of this material layer. So to change the blending, all we have to do is go to the Material Trans tab under Blend Mode, and we want to set this to Multiply. Now you can see the colors pop through, but the whites aren't very white, and the greens are a little darker, and so is the yellow. Now the reason for this is because back under the Material Ref tab, the diffuse amount is set to 80%. And if we set this on down to say 10%, you can see it darkens everything. And what we really want is to make sure that white color is 100% white. So let's do that. And now everything looks as it should. Now, this isn't going to work in every case, but the reason it's working in this case is because the color that we have for the material is white. And when you multiply white, which is a value of 1, you're going to get the same value of whatever it is you're multiplying by. So, in this case, it works. In other cases, maybe not. And now what I want to do is apply one of our cherries onto the cellophane material. But before we do that, I want to clean up our item list and shader sheet just a little bit. Now, we have some texture locators here that are mysterious, really. Now, we've got mixed texture 2 and mixed texture. Now, what the heck are those? Let's go find out. And it most likely resides under the top front logo since, of course, that's the only place that we have something in there that isn't called burst. And you may recall we already parented the burst there, so it's got to be one of these two images, the Modo's logo or the cherry flavor logo. So it's going to reside here. So it looks like mixed texture 2 is for the cherries, and that means the other one is for the Modo's logo red. You can also expand the texture layer, and that tells you exactly which one is here. So right off, let's just rename this one here. We'll call this Large Cherries Logo Texture Locator, and I call it TLOC. Okay, so we have that, and the other one is Modo's Logo TLOC. And when we expand that out, it's very clearly labeled, and we know what is going on with those. The reason we're doing that is because we're about to duplicate these cherries here and move them on down. And if we have to move multiple or we can't find it, and granted, it was only one, it was kind of easy to find, but if you have multiple items in a scene or multiple texture locators, it's good to name them, and that way you don't get confused. Keeping your scene clean can really help speed up your workflow. So now that we've done that, what we need to do is expose the cellophane. And we're not going to be viewing the box during this process, so we'll just hide the box and have the cellophane. And oh, what do you know? Our gradient is being applied to the cellophane. The reason that's happening is because there's nothing stopping this gradient from being applied to it. It's being applied to everything inside of this box material group. Now, what we need to do is make a selection set for this. Let's go to the Modeling tab, select our box item, make sure it's visible, and we'll zoom in. Go to Polygon mode, select all the polygons. Now, I want all the interior and exterior polygons to be applied with this because the interior of the box is also painted on numerous parts, except where it's cut, but we'll deal with that part later. Now, we want all the polygons to have this gradient on it, so we'll just double-click and select everything. Go to Select, Assign Selection Set, and we're going to call this Whole Box. Hit OK. Go back to the Render tab. Go back to Item Mode. Okay, so now what we need to do is make a material group for this. And we want this to be at the bottom, basically where the gradient is. So we'll select the gradient, hit Add Layer, and go Group. And of course, to create at the top. So we'll just place it at the bottom. Select our gradient, drag it into the group. And then let's change the polygon tag type again to Selection Set, polygon tag to Whole Box. All right, so now we have that set. Let's hide the box, and the cellophane itself should have exactly what we expect. Now we can turn our cellophane material group on and see what it looks like. Everything looks good. Okay, so now we can get on with what we wanted to do originally, is to put a cherry logo on the cellophane. So let's go to our cellophane material group, expand that out, and our top front logos group, expand that out as well. We'll select these one at a time and duplicate them. So duplicate the diffuse, place that above the thin film material, right click on the spec layer, drag that up, place that in there as well, and lastly our bump, and place that on the top as well. Now that we have that completed, you'll notice that we actually have two large cherry logo texture locators. So we need to make sure that these three layers here have the same texture locator, and that these three down below in the top front logos material group also have the same locator as each other, but different from those two groups. Okay, so it looks like the diffuse color is actually with the new locator, and the bump and spec layers are using the old locator. We don't want that at all. Let's rename this one here. We're going to call this one Large Cherries Logo TLOC. We'll just put a prefix on here as lower. And the one that already existed, we'll just call this upper. Okay, so now we can select all three of these layers that are in the cellophane group. And under the texture layers tab where it says locator, we need to change this to lower large cherries logo TLOC. Deselect the texture locators, and then we'll select each of these layers in the shader tree to make sure that they are in fact assigned that texture locator, and they are. And let's go ahead and make sure that these ones on the upper portion are also correct, and those are also just fine. While we're at it, we might as well rename the gradient. We'll call this base color gradient. Now that we have that finally completed, we can go to the lower large cherries texture locator. We're going to move this on down over toward the right of the box here. Make sure we pull it out a little bit so it's easily selectable. Now, right off, you'll notice that, of course, the cherries, while they still have the bump visible, they are very transparent. And that's because of our cellophane material here. It has a transparency of 75%. Now, we have a number of ways we can solve this issue. We could set up a group mask with the image of the cherries, or we could create a layer mask. And if we had multiple images on here, we'd need to do a group mask, because a layer mask can only have one image or one mask per layer, unfortunately. In our case, luckily, that's what we can do. We can just make one layer mask. And what we'll need for that is the image, and we already have this set up with the bump map. So let's right-click on the Cherry Modo's bump. We'll duplicate this, and very easily, we'll just drag and drop this onto the material for that group. And now you can see that area of the material is being cut out, and it's no longer getting that transparency applied to it. So that's really making our life a whole lot easier than having to set up a bunch of group masks and making a child group to the cellophane material, putting the material in there, and making our group mask. Let's go ahead and unhide our item and see what it looks like. And we'll let this render. All right, so right off, you'll notice that the eyes are transparent, and we definitely do not want that. So how can we solve this? Well, we have the layer mask of the image here, and let's make sure that we have it selected. So if it's converting this color image to black and white, something in here is being converted to white. It's already white, which happen to be the eyes. And so what we need to do is actually change the high value from 100 so that it's not white. We'll just set this to 1%, for example. And you can see it's no longer transparent. In fact, we'll just set that to 0 so that way there's no question about it whatsoever. Before we start, I just want to mention that I've already hidden the render boolean and window boolean because we don't really need that for this portion of the video, and I really need preview to be a little bit faster. Right, so what we're going to be doing in this section is sprinkling the cherries around the box. And we could do this a number of ways. We could use a surface particle generator, which has some really nice randomization options. And the reason we're not using it is because it's a little too random for what we're doing here. We could use the particle painting tools, or we could just simply use the retopo tools and put in a few vertices with some polygons and call it good. It's a lot quicker, it's easier, it's a little more interesting, and we have precise control over where our cherries are being placed. So that's what we're going to do. Let's expand our box layer out, and we're going to be placing those cherries in the whole box group. So let's go ahead and open that up. And we're going to be using the cherry diffuse layer we already have. So let's right click on this and duplicate it. Bring that on down to the whole box group. And in item mode, make sure that we have just that one selected. Activate the move tool with the W key. Bring this on down to somewhere around the center here. So now you can see we have it there. It's a little large for what we're going to be using, and we want to scale this down. So let's go to the texture locator. We're going to set this to 2 centimeters. See what it looks like. Yeah, that's about right. We want that about a little less than half the size of the upper one up there. Now, over here under the texture replicator subgroup, we have particle source, and that's what we're going to be using to specify our mesh. But first, we need to create the mesh. So let's go to the Topo tab. We'll add a new item, mesh. Make sure that it is parented to the box locator, and we'll put this at the bottom of the list. Let's rename this to Cherry Sprinkle Source. Okay, so now with the pen tool, let's place a large polygon here. Let's go to polygon mode, or any element mode for that matter. We want to edit it with the topology pen tool. Let's make sure these vertices aren't too close to the edge, otherwise we'll get some bleeding onto the other parts here. And what that can do is cause a little bit of distortion with the images, and we definitely don't want that. Wherever we have a vertex is where Cherry is going to be. So let's place one right there. One over here is cool. I like one back there. This one can be down right here. And let's hold down the shift button, middle mouse click on that edge, and it will create an edge loop for us. And we can move this one over here and maybe this one back there. Now let's go take a look and see what it's done for us. In the render tab, it hasn't done much for us because we still haven't specified that mesh as the particle source. So back over here to our Cherry Modo's logo under the whole box, under the texture locator, let's set the particle source as that Cherry Sprinkle source. Now you can see we've got a couple of red dots here. They're obviously too small. And the reason is because the particle size is set to 0.2 or 20% of the original size. So if we set this to 1, back at the original size of 2 centimeters. Let's change the bias, the fallout bias. What that will do is it will make the edges of our image harder and the gain for that as well. And we'll throw a little bit of random rotation. Well, I say a little bit, we're doing 360 degrees. Okay, that's looking pretty cool. Now, of course, we don't want that mesh visible when we render. So under the Mesh Properties tab, we have a Mesh subgroup, and we want to change the render setting to No, because we don't want this to render. And now I see, of course, we've got a little bit of a repeating line here from our 3 aligned vertices. So let's go fix that. Activate the topology pen tool, and it looks like these 3 are kind of lined up. So we'll bring this one up, and we'll push that one forward, that one back, and maybe this one down. Back to the render room. That looks pretty good. Now let's go back to the retopo room, and we'll do the front. So we'll use the pen tool again, and we'll place a large quad in here. Activate the topology pen tool, hold down shift, middle mouse click again. So the front side is a little bit different. Because we have that rendered boolean, we actually need to place these a little closer to the edge. So we'll drag these out near the corners and something like so. And this one will place a little more toward the top right. And the one on the bottom will go toward the left a little. And right there. And I think that we should probably have some in the middle here. So we'll place an edge loop in here as we did previous. Move this one up and this one down. Now let's take a look in the render tab. That looks pretty good. Of course, our bursts are overlapping our cherries, which we'll take care of here momentarily. But first, let's go ahead and place a mesh on the very top here. Pen tool, place another quad again. All right, topology pen tool now. And we're going to place just one edge loop in here for the depth and then one for the width of the box. And we'll just move these around to place them where we want them. Let's take a look and see how it is in the render tab after this last tweak here. All right, that looks pretty good from this angle. Doesn't look too repeating. And this angle is the more important one. But just to make sure that it's looking all right, let's go to the view look cam and look at it from the top. And it looks pretty good. So we are good to go there. Let's go back to our render camera. All right, so now we have that issue of the burst overlaying. the cherries. And let's discuss a little bit about why this is happening. So this whole box group is down at the bottom of our shader tree. And of course, the bursts are at the top. So naturally, the bursts are going to overlay our cherries. Now, we want to use this whole box group to cover the entire box. But this needs to be down at the bottom because the gradient for the base color is at the bottom. And of course, needs to reside at the bottom. So we can't move that. So what do we do? Well, we can duplicate the whole box. And if you expand this new duplicated group out, you can see we have a duplicate of the gradient and the cherries. And we don't want that. What we do want is just one with cherries and one with the gradient. So from this upper one here, we'll delete the gradient. And the lower one, we'll delete the cherries. Now what we need to do is move this upper one above our burst. And what that will do is it will place the cherries above the burst. So let's make sure that we are using our render camera. Looks like we weren't. And now you can see the cherries are above those bursts. Let's turn our render boolean back on and we'll get a good idea of what's going on here. We're going to turn the cellophane off. That way we get a quicker render. And you can see that those cherries are actually going all the way to the inside of the box as well, which is perfect. That looks very cool. All right, now that we have the sprinkled cherries completed, we should make an accompanying bump and spec map. So what we can do, just like we did with the one in the top left corner there, is right click, create instance. This one's going to be the spec map. And so what we need to do is make sure that the spec map is inverted and that the spec is actually down to 2%. Okay. And then we'll right click on this, go to the basics section and set a specular amount. One thing I also wanted to do that I didn't do on the other cherries is to raise the low value. So that way it's a little bit higher than 0. And I think that would be a wonderful idea. Let's go ahead and just set to 50%. And we'll lower the high value as well. We'll lower that to about 80%. So they're both in their mid-gray range. And the black area is actually getting some specularity. And we should really do that to the top one as well. So we'll click on that top cherry there, and that will expand out the material for that group. Go to the spec for that, and we'll set the low value. Before we do that, let's go and take a look at our bump layer. I'm pretty sure this is a duplicate of the original spec, so these values shouldn't be changed. 0 and 100. And we'll keep note of that, and we'll change the spec layer to 50 and 80 respectively. And we'll go back to this one. And in fact, it's an instance of the instance. So for the bump, I actually do want to do the same thing as well, just not to this degree. Let's change this to about 20%, and we'll leave the high at 100%. So that way, anything that's black is actually no longer black. It's a low-level gray, and it's getting bumped up a little bit, whereas before it was not at all. And the same thing goes for the specularity. Anything that had no spec before now has a little bit of spec, and anything that had maximum specularity is actually brought down. So we're kind of equalizing the images a little bit. All right, back over to the sprinkled cherries here. Now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and duplicate that layer, not instance. And we'll change the low and high values again. We'll go back to 20 and 100 to do the same thing as we did with the cherry on the top left. And the other thing we need to do is turn off invert. We don't want that to be inverted. And we also want the bump opacity to be at 100% for that layer. 2 more things and we are all done. We need to set the effect of the layer that we just duplicated to bump. So right click on the effect, go to surface shading and bump. Now let's take a look at that. It's very faint looking, but it looks pretty good. We don't want it to be too overpowering. And the last thing we want to do is change the name of this here. We'll just call this sprinkled cherries dash whole box. So we'll leave the whole box on there to let us know that that material group is being applied to the whole box.